Stop scrolling right now, because what you are about to hear could directly affect what you legally own in your home without you even realizing it. Across the United States, thousands of gun owners are waking up to a shocking reality in 2026. Firearms they legally purchased just a few years ago are now restricted, heavily regulated, or in some states, completely illegal. And the most terrifying part is that many of them were never clearly notified until enforcement began. Police seizures, court notices, sudden registration deadlines. This is not a future warning anymore. It is happening right now, state by state, and in some cases, it is happening overnight. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly which types of firearms are being targeted, why the Supreme Court's recent interpretations have triggered this wave of restrictions, and how thousands of ordinary gun owners are suddenly finding themselves on the wrong side of rapidly changing laws. Now, before we go deeper, there is something crucial you need to understand. There is no single national gun law in the United States that works the same everywhere. Instead, there is a layered system made up of federal law, state law, and Supreme Court rulings that constantly reinterpret what is allowed and what is not. That means a firearm that is perfectly legal in one state can be completely illegal just across the border. And in 2026, that gap between states has never been wider. Recent Supreme Court decisions have not created a nationwide ban, but what they have done is give states more power to define what they consider dangerous weapons. And that has triggered a chain reaction across multiple states, leading to new bans, new classifications, and aggressive enforcement actions. Let's start with what many experts are calling one of the most controversial categories right now, so-called assault-style rifles. While the term itself is not a technical legal definition, it is used in legislation to describe semi-automatic rifles with military-style features, such as detachable magazines, pistol grips, folding stocks, or flash suppressors. In several states, including California, New York, Illinois, and parts of the Northeast, updated laws now restrict or ban specific configurations of these rifles. What makes this especially confusing is that the firearm itself may not be banned in its entirety, but specific features attached to it make it illegal. That means two rifles that look almost identical can have completely different legal status depending on small design details. And in 2026, more states are tightening these definitions, narrowing what is allowed and what must be registered or modified. Now here is where things become even more serious. High-capacity magazines are another major target of new restrictions. In multiple states, magazines that hold more than 10 or 15 rounds are now either banned or heavily restricted. Law enforcement agencies argue that limiting magazine capacity reduces mass shooting potential, while gun rights advocates argue it only affects lawful owners and does not stop criminals. But regardless of the debate, enforcement is becoming stricter, and in some regions, possession of previously legal magazines is now resulting in fines, confiscation, or mandatory surrender programs. Many gun owners are only discovering this when attempting to purchase ammunition or renew permits, and by then, it is already too late. Another category now under heavy scrutiny is short-barreled rifles and short-barreled shotguns. These firearms have always been regulated under federal law through the National Firearms Act, requiring special registration and taxation. But in 2026, some states are layering additional restrictions on top of federal requirements. In certain jurisdictions, even legal federal registration does not guarantee state compliance. This dual-layer system is creating confusion, even among experienced firearm owners, because what is federally legal is not always state-approved. That contradiction is at the center of ongoing legal battles that could eventually return to the Supreme Court again. Then there are so-called ghost guns, which have become one of the fastest-growing regulatory targets in the country. These are privately made firearms, often assembled from parts kits or 3D printed components without serial numbers. Federal regulations have tightened significantly in recent years, requiring serialization and background checks for certain kits and components. Several states have gone even further, banning possession of unserialized firearms entirely. Enforcement agencies argue that these weapons are untraceable and therefore dangerous in criminal investigations. However, critics argue that these laws are difficult to enforce and often affect hobbyists and legal builders more than criminals. In 2026, enforcement campaigns against ghost guns have expanded, with several high-profile raids and court cases making national headlines. Another surprising category affected by recent legal shifts involves pistol braces. These devices were originally marketed as stabilizing supports for one-handed firing, but became widely used in configurations that effectively turned large pistols into compact, rifle-like weapons. After years of regulatory back and forth, federal agencies reclassified many of these setups, leading to new registration requirements and restrictions. Some states have adopted these rules aggressively, while others have challenged them in court. The result is a confusing legal landscape where identical firearms can be legal in one state but restricted in another based solely on the presence of a brace. Now, here is where the Supreme Court enters the picture. Recent rulings have focused heavily on how gun regulations must align with historical tradition under the Second Amendment. Instead of allowing broad, modern interpretations, courts are now required to compare new laws with historical regulations from the founding era. This shift has led to both expansions and limitations, depending on the case. Some laws have been struck down for lacking historical precedent, while others have been upheld because similar restrictions existed in early American history. But the key impact is this. States now feel both empowered and pressured to redefine their gun laws quickly in anticipation of future legal challenges. This has created what many legal experts call a patchwork acceleration effect. States are rapidly rewriting firearm laws not just to address safety concerns, but also to position themselves favorably for future court battles. That means laws are changing faster than ever before, and enforcement is becoming more aggressive as states attempt to establish legal precedent. For gun owners, this creates a situation where staying compliant is no longer a one-time task, but an ongoing responsibility that can change every year, sometimes even every few months. And while all of this is happening at the legal and political level, the real-world impact is far more personal. Gun owners across the country are receiving unexpected notices requiring registration updates, feature modifications, or surrender deadlines. Some are discovering that firearms they purchased legally are now classified differently under updated laws. Others are facing penalties simply for not being aware that regulations changed in their state. This is not about theoretical debate anymore. It is about active enforcement and rapidly shifting legal definitions. One of the most important things to understand in 2026 is that compliance is no longer just about federal law. It is about understanding your state, your local jurisdiction, and even pending legislation that may not yet be fully enforced but is already affecting legal status. Legal experts warn that ignorance is no longer considered a strong defense in many of these cases, especially when public registration notices or amnesty periods have been issued. And yet, despite all the controversy, the debate is far from settled. Gun rights organizations continue to challenge many of these restrictions in court, arguing that they violate constitutional protections. Meanwhile, advocacy groups pushing for stricter regulation argue that evolving technology and increased firearm accessibility require updated legal frameworks. This ongoing conflict ensures that gun laws in the United States will continue to shift, likely for years to come. So, when people ask, what is actually happening with guns in America right now? The answer is not simple. There is no single ban, no single ruling that changed everything overnight. Instead, there is a slow but accelerating transformation happening through a combination of court decisions, state laws, and enforcement policies that together are reshaping what is legal, what is restricted, and what is becoming increasingly difficult to own. And if you are still watching right now, you probably already understand why this matters more than ever. Because whether you are a gun owner, a collector, or just someone trying to understand your rights, the reality is that the rules are changing faster than most people realize. What was legal yesterday may not be legal tomorrow in your state, and the only real protection in this environment is awareness. So the real question is not just which guns are restricted or banned, it is how well you actually understand the laws where you live, and whether you would even know if something you owned suddenly became non-compliant. And that is exactly why staying informed is no longer optional in 2026. It is essential. And the most unsettling part is that even after understanding all of this, most people still feel confident that they are safe, simply because they bought their firearm legally in the past. But in 2026, that assumption is exactly what is catching thousands of gun owners off guard, because legality is no longer a permanent status tied to purchase. It is becoming a shifting condition tied to evolving definitions, court interpretations, and state-level enforcement priorities. And once you understand how this system actually operates behind the scenes, you start to realize that the real issue is not just what is banned, but how easily something can quietly move from legal to restricted without a dramatic announcement that reaches every owner in time. One of the most overlooked areas in this entire debate is transportation laws. Many gun owners assume that if they are legally allowed to own a firearm, they are also allowed to move it freely from one location to another. But in reality, transportation is one of the most legally sensitive parts of gun ownership in the United States. In some states, a firearm must be unloaded, locked in a case, and separated from ammunition. In others, additional permits may be required for concealed transport. And when you cross state lines, the rules can change instantly, sometimes in ways that are not obvious unless you have studied each jurisdiction carefully. There have been real situations where individuals legally departed one state with a firearm, only to unknowingly enter another state where their exact configuration was restricted, turning a routine trip into a legal emergency. What makes this even more complicated is the federal protection known as safe passage laws, which are intended to allow lawful transport of firearms across states under specific conditions. However, these protections are not absolute, and they depend heavily on compliance with both departure and destination laws. That means a small mistake in storage, documentation, or routing can potentially expose someone to legal consequences, despite their original intent being fully lawful. And this is exactly the kind of legal complexity that most everyday owners never anticipate until they are already in the middle of it. Now, add to this another growing issue: changing definitions of what constitutes possession. In several recent legal interpretations, possession is no longer limited to physically holding a firearm. It can include constructive possession, meaning the firearm is accessible, stored in a shared space, or even under certain conditions within a property. This becomes especially important in households with multiple occupants, roommates, or shared storage areas. In some enforcement cases, authorities have examined not just ownership, but accessibility, storage conditions, and whether all legal requirements were met by every person with potential access. This creates a legal gray zone that many gun owners are completely unaware of until they face a compliance review or investigation. And then there is the digital dimension that is quietly becoming one of the most controversial parts of modern firearm regulation. The rise of 3D printing technology, online parts marketplaces, and digital firearm blueprints has introduced an entirely new category of regulatory concern. Even though many of these technologies have legitimate hobbyist and industrial applications, regulators are increasingly focusing on how easily firearm components can be manufactured outside traditional commercial channels. This has led to stricter rules around certain kits, unfinished receivers, and modular components that can be assembled into functioning firearms. The result is that even partial components can sometimes fall under legal scrutiny, depending on how they are classified in a given state. What is especially interesting is that many of these changes are not happening through a single sweeping federal law, but through a combination of regulatory reinterpretations and court-backed adjustments that gradually redefine categories over time. This means that instead of one clear moment where everything changes, there are hundreds of smaller legal shifts happening across different jurisdictions, each one slightly adjusting the boundaries of what is allowed. And for the average gun owner who is not tracking legal updates daily, these incremental changes can easily go unnoticed until enforcement catches up. Another major source of confusion is licensing and permit systems. In some states, permits are required to purchase, own, or carry firearms, while in others, no permit is needed at all for basic ownership. But even in states with permit systems, renewal requirements, training standards, and background check thresholds can change over time. That means someone who was fully compliant when they first applied for a permit may find that renewal conditions have changed significantly years later. In certain cases, failure to meet updated requirements can result in suspension or revocation of privileges, even if the original permit was issued legally under older rules. And here is where things become even more intense. Enforcement priority shifts. Law enforcement agencies do not always enforce every rule equally at all times. Instead, priorities can change based on political leadership, public safety concerns, court rulings, or resource allocation. This means that a law that existed for years with minimal enforcement can suddenly become a major focus area, resulting in increased inspections, compliance checks, or targeted enforcement operations. For gun owners, this creates the illusion that a law is inactive or low risk, when in reality it may simply not have been prioritized yet. One of the most emotionally charged aspects of this entire system is how quickly ordinary individuals can become entangled in legal consequences without any criminal intent. There are documented situations where people believed they were fully compliant, only to later discover that a small technical detail, such as magazine capacity, barrel length, or accessory configuration, placed their firearm into a restricted category under updated state definitions. In many of these cases, the issue is not criminal behavior, but regulatory mismatch between evolving laws and outdated assumptions. And while debates continue at the political and legal level, there is another layer that rarely gets discussed in public conversations: uncertainty fatigue. Many gun owners report feeling overwhelmed, not because they are unwilling to comply, but because the rules themselves are so complex and variable that keeping up with them feels like a full-time responsibility. When laws change frequently and differ from state to state, even well-intentioned individuals can struggle to maintain full compliance. This is not just a legal issue anymore. It is becoming a practical challenge of constant awareness. At the same time, legal advocacy groups on both sides of the debate are actively pushing cases through courts, hoping to establish long-term clarity. Some argue that current restrictions go too far and lack historical grounding, while others argue that modern firearm technology requires modern regulation frameworks that adapt to new realities. This ongoing legal conflict ensures that the system remains in motion, with new rulings potentially reshaping previous interpretations at any time. And every time a major case is decided, it can trigger a ripple effect across multiple states that adjust their laws in response. Now, here is something most people do not expect. Even court decisions that appear to clarify gun rights often lead to more complexity at the state level. When a broad ruling is issued, states frequently respond by revising their laws to align with the interpretation, while still maintaining certain restrictions. This creates a legal adaptation cycle, where clarity at the federal level does not always translate into simplicity on the ground. Instead, it often leads to new definitions, revised categories, and updated enforcement guidelines that continue to evolve over time. And in the middle of all this, everyday citizens are left trying to interpret a system that is constantly moving. Gun ownership, which many people see as a straightforward legal right, becomes in practice a highly detailed compliance landscape, where small details matter just as much as broad rights. This includes how firearms are stored, how they are modified, how they are transported, and even how they are documented. Each layer adds another point where compliance must be maintained, and each change in law adds another layer of complexity. So when people hear headlines about guns being banned, restricted, or declared illegal, the reality is often more nuanced than the headline suggests. It is rarely about a single universal ban, and more often about specific categories, configurations, or jurisdictional rules that redefine legality in narrow but important ways. And understanding those details is what separates confusion from clarity in 2026. As this situation continues to evolve, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The future of gun laws in the United States is not going to become simpler anytime soon. If anything, the combination of technology, court rulings, and state-level legislation suggests that the system will continue to develop in layers, each one adding more detail, more nuance, and more responsibility for individuals to stay informed. And that brings everything back to the central point of this entire discussion. The real challenge is not just knowing what is legal today, but understanding that legality itself is becoming something dynamic rather than static. What you are allowed to own, carry, or modify depends not just on national principles, but on constantly evolving interpretations that vary across time and place. So if you are still watching right now, you are already ahead of most people who assume the system is simple. Because the truth is, it is not. It is complex, shifting, and deeply tied to legal interpretations that continue to evolve year after year. And in this environment, awareness is no longer optional. It is the only way to stay aligned with a system that is constantly rewriting its own boundaries.